The sun over Helmand felt closer than it should have been, burning through the haze and sand until every breath tasted like heat. The forward operating base sat like a forgotten patch of metal and plywood, ringed with sandbags that did little to stop the wind. The air shimmered, bending the horizon, and every sound carried too far the rattle of gear, the scrape of boots on gravel, the dry hum of the desert itself. In the middle of it, Staff Sergeant Emma Walsh worked quietly on the firing line. The long shadow of her Macmillan TAC-50 stretched across the dust like a second spine. Lieutenant Commander Mark Halford from SEAL Team 7 stood nearby, his tone casual but heavy with habit. "What are you doing with the Barrett 50, sweetheart?" The words fell flat in the air, part challenge, part amusement, the kind that didn't need an audience but always found one. Emma didn't answer. She tightened the torque wrench on the Leupold Mk4 scope, checked the alignment, and set the rifle down with the same care most people reserved for glass. The sweat on her neck mixed with dust, running in faint lines along the edge of her collar. Halford waited for a reaction, arms folded across his plate carrier, the hint of a grin under his squint. Around them, a few of his men watched in silence, the moment stretching just long enough for the desert to feel even louder. Emma finally spoke, her voice even and quiet. "Just making sure it's ready, sir." Then she turned back to her weapon, her hands steady, her breathing even. Halford's boots crunched as he walked off, muttering something about kids and rifles too big for them. The sound faded behind the low rumble of generators, leaving only the hum of heat and the steady rhythm of her breath. Emma adjusted the bipod and looked out toward the horizon, where the shimmer of air hid everything that mattered. She didn't need to answer his question again. In 2 days, when the valley filled with dust and radio chatter, it would answer itself. Bozeman was the kind of place where the wind never stopped moving. It came down from the mountains cold and sharp, carrying dust in the summer and snow in the fall. Staff Sergeant Emma Walsh grew up under that sky, learning early that the world didn't slow down for anyone. Her father, Thomas Walsh, had been a Marine Scout sniper during the Gulf War. He didn't talk much about it, but the lessons were always there, taught without ceremony. Patience, breath control, respect for the weapon and what it could do. Her mother, Ellen, taught something different. She taught math at the local high school and believed that numbers could explain almost anything, even the wind that shifted every few seconds in the valley. She showed Emma how to chart wind speed against distance, how to calculate trajectory, and why a tiny mistake at the muzzle became a miss by feet downrange. Between the two of them, Emma learned that shooting wasn't about pulling a trigger. It was about harmony between movement and stillness, between instinct and calculation. She was 12 the first time she fired her father's Remington 700, the rifle bedded and tuned by his own hands. The recoil knocked her shoulder hard, and the shot landed wide, 2 feet off the paper target. She had braced for laughter, but her father just crouched beside her, quiet for a moment, then told her she was stronger than that kick if she decided to be. It was the kind of sentence that stayed with her long after the bruise faded. By 15, she was calling wind like second nature, reading the grass, the dust, and the shimmer in the air before every shot. By 18, she had won 2 national junior long-range championships. Her name whispered around small-town ranges as the girl who could outshoot grown men. When she turned 19, she walked into a recruiting office and told them she wanted a combat role. They tried steering her toward intelligence, then logistics. But she wouldn't bend. It took 3 separate requests before the Army sent her to Fort Benning for the sniper course. She was the only woman in her class, quiet and focused, outshooting most by the second week. It wasn't talent that set her apart. It was the years of wind, math, and silence that had built her steady hands. The Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Cushimon buzzed with low voices and the steady hum of equipment. Maps covered the walls, dotted with red and blue icons that shifted as the intelligence feed updated in real time. SEAL Team 7 was preparing for a strike against Bashir Nozi, a Taliban leader responsible for coordinating IED networks across Helmand Province. Satellite imagery placed him inside a compound tucked deep between steep ridges, about 3.2 kilometers northeast of the base. The terrain was brutal. Every approach route was exposed, and anyone attempting to close the distance would be visible long before reaching the objective. The mission planners laid out two options. The first was a fast rope nighttime assault from MH-60S helicopters, landing the SEALs on a nearby hilltop before advancing on foot. It would be fast and direct, but high risk, with limited exfil routes if the team took fire. The second option was surgical. One round, one target, no American boots near the compound. The sniper solution. Silence filled the room while the officers weighed both options, the tension thick enough to make even the air feel slow. When the decision came, it was quiet, but final. They would take the long shot. Lieutenant Commander Mark Halford's expression shifted from focus to disbelief as the assignment list came across his tablet. The designated shooter was Staff Sergeant Emma Walsh, attached to the task force as a long-range interdiction specialist. He leaned back, crossing his arms, his tone skeptical as he looked across the table. A shot like that wasn't just hard, it was nearly impossible under combat conditions. He asked if she had ever fired that far, outside a range. Emma kept her voice even. She stated her qualifications, mentioned her recent training cycle, and confirmed previous engagements beyond 2 kilometers. Halford's frown didn't fade. He muttered something about wind shifts and moving targets. She didn't argue. Her answer was simple. With respect. Sir, numbers don't care who pulls the trigger. The room went quiet again, and a few of the SEALs exchanged glances, uncertain whether to smirk or stay still. By the time the briefing ended, the plan was set. The engagement window would open at 05:30 the following morning. As the teams dispersed, Emma packed her gear, checking her scope mounts, her data book, and her spotter's range card. She wasn't thinking about proving anything. She was thinking about wind, elevation, and the math of distance. The rest would solve itself once the shot was fired. The base never really slept, even after dark. The hum of the generators filled the air, low and steady, like a heartbeat under the desert night. Somewhere beyond the walls, a CH-47 Chinook circled in for landing, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust that swirled against the floodlights. Inside, her quarters. Staff Sergeant Emma Walsh sat on the edge of her cot, the smell of gun oil still on her hands, her rifle disassembled and cleaned to perfection. Her data book lay open beside her, the thin pages filled with columns of numbers, angles, and notes that looked more like a mathematician's journal than a soldier's. She read the distance again. 3,247 meters, temperature 42 degrees Celsius, barometric pressure low, wind variable between 15 and 20 knots, elevation adjustment 31 mils up, wind correction between 0.2 and 0.3 mil right. Each figure mattered. A tenth off in wind call meant a miss by feet. A single miscalculated mil could turn a confirmed kill into a ghost story. She recorded the numbers carefully, pressing her pencil into the page until the marks cut slightly into the paper. The math was her ritual, her way of taking the unknown and turning it into something she could control. Outside, someone shouted orders across the compound. A burst of laughter followed by the metallic clatter of a gate closing. The sounds faded quickly. Inside her mind, there was only quiet. Every calculation brought her closer to calm, each adjustment a reminder that chaos could be tamed by precision. She thought of her father back in Montana, his steady voice as he corrected her stance, telling her that precision was a form of respect, not for the weapon, not even for the target, but for the act itself. If you were going to take a shot, You owed it everything. The pencil paused as another memory surfaced. Fort Benning. The sniper. Course. Her instructor standing over her after the first week of live fire, telling her she didn't belong there. Not because she couldn't shoot, but because the teams wouldn't take her seriously. She hadn't argued. She'd simply walked back to the firing line, waited for the wind to settle, and sent 5 rounds through the same hole at 600 yards. The instructor hadn't said another word. She turned the page, checking the environmental notes again. Temperature fluctuations could alter muzzle velocity by just enough to matter. The longer she studied the numbers, the more her thoughts quieted. Fear and doubt didn't disappear, but they lost their shape, becoming small enough to hold. That was the gift of numbers. They didn't care who you were, what you looked like, or how many people thought you didn't belong. They cared only for accuracy. The lights flickered once as the generators cycled, and the wind pressed against the thin canvas walls. Emma closed her notebook and rested her hands on it for a moment. The air smelled of fuel, dust, and metal. Tomorrow she would take the shot, and the numbers she had written would decide everything. She whispered softly, her voice almost lost to the sound of the wind. Numbers don't care who you are. Then she exhaled, slow and steady, the way she had been taught since she was 12. At 05:30, the desert was already awake. The air shimmered with heat that hadn't yet earned the day, and the first light pushed through the horizon in a dull orange haze. The forward operating base behind them was a low hum of engines, rotor wash, and radio static. Staff Sergeant Emma Walsh moved out with her small overwatch team, 4 silhouettes cutting through the sand and rock. Every step was measured. Every sound was absorbed by the valley. She carried the Macmillan TAC-50 across her back, the weight familiar grounding. Corporal Ryan Hayes followed close behind, his pack heavy with the laser rangefinder, ballistic computer, and extra magazines. The valley below stretched wide and unforgiving. Dust rose from the ridgeline like smoke, and the distant hum of insects mixed with the faint metallic ring of heat against stone. They climbed slow, keeping below the crest, crawling the last few yards to avoid breaking the skyline. The position overlooked the valley, the target compound a cluster of mud brick buildings barely visible through the shimmer. Emma lay flat, breathing through her nose, letting her body settle into the earth. Hayes set up the spotting scope and rangefinder, steadying them on a small tripod. Range confirmed. 3,247 meters. The number hung between them like a promise. Emma pulled the rifle into position, unfolding the bipod legs and resting the muzzle just over the edge of a sandbag. She adjusted the loopholed MK4 scope, checking parallax, dialing elevation to 31 mils up, then inputting the data into the Kestrel 5700, temperature 42 degrees Celsius. Wind 10 to 15 knots, variable. She fine-tuned her hold, her gloved hand resting on the stock, cheek pressed to the comb, body aligned perfectly behind the bore. The radio crackled softly. Command confirmed the target was inside the compound and moving between structures. Hayes scanned through the mirage, his voice low, calm, numbers clipped and steady. Wind 0.2 right, then shifting to 0.3. Mirage boiling left, then stilling. She adjusted one click, then waited. The courtyard was quiet except for a few moving shapes. Then the man stepped out, dark vest over a white tunic, hands behind his back as he spoke to 2 others near the doorway. Hayes called it again. Wind stable. Target clear. Emma began her breathing cycle. 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. The crosshairs floated with her pulse, then steadied. The desert fell silent. Her finger found the trigger, taking the slack slowly, and the shot broke clean. The recoil pushed against her shoulder, heavy but smooth. The sound was a single crack swallowed by the valley. The rifle lifted, then settled, and for a long moment, nothing moved. The bullet cut through 2 miles of air, a 4-second eternity where time lost its shape. Then, through the scope, the target dropped. Clean hit. Center mass. The 2 men beside him scattered, dust kicking up in a pale burst. The radio erupted. Long shot. This is Toki. Confirm target down. Repeat. Target down. Hayes didn't speak. He was still locked on the scope, eyes wide. The distance, the wind, the drop, it didn't seem possible. Emma cycled the bolt, cleared the chamber, and locked the rifle safe. Her voice came quiet but firm over the comms. Long shot confirms. 1 round, 1 target. Position cold. The wind picked up, carrying the faint echo of rotor blades somewhere beyond the horizon. The valley looked unchanged, as if the shot had never happened. Hayes finally looked over, his face pale, still processing what they had just done. "That was impossible," he whispered, but the words barely carried. Emma checked her dope card, closed her notebook, and started breaking down the rifle. It wasn't luck. It wasn't magic. It was math, she said softly, more to herself than to him. Then she stood, the desert stretching endlessly in every direction, and began the quiet climb back toward the base. Inside the Tactical Operations Center, no one spoke. The drone feed showed the courtyard in grainy detail, a small figure collapsing backward in a puff of dust. For a full 10 seconds, the room stayed frozen, the air filled with the soft hum of equipment and the low hiss of static from the speakers. Lieutenant Commander Mark Halford leaned closer to the monitor. His arms no longer crossed. He had watched the impossible happen. The same shot he had dismissed as fantasy had landed clean, precise, and final. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his jaw, the disbelief fading into quiet respect. Then, almost under his breath, he said what everyone was already thinking. That was one hell of a shot. By the time the sun began to fall that evening, the base was alive again with movement. Emma Walsh and her team returned covered in dust, faces streaked and tired but calm. The heat had broken into a slow breeze that carried the smell of oil and sand through the compound. Near the firing range, Halford waited. He stood differently now, his posture no longer rigid, his expression open. When she approached, he didn't try for small talk. He simply met her eyes and said he owed her an apology. She nodded once, her voice steady but distant. Respectfully, "Sir, I'm used to it." It wasn't defiance, just truth, spoken without weight. Halford held her gaze for a long moment, then replied softly, "You shouldn't have to be." 3 days later, the debriefing took place under fluorescent light in the JSOC Forward Command Center. The walls were covered with maps, target photos, and mission logs. The room smelled faintly of coffee and dust. Emma sat quietly beside her spotter, Corporal Ryan Hayes, as the officers went through the report. Range, 3,247 meters. Wind, 10 to 15 knots. Time of flight, 4 seconds. Hayes explained each variable with precision, his voice even, his pride visible only in the small tightening of his jaw. Emma said little, listening as the data told the story better than words ever could. When the commanding officer asked for recommendations, Halford stood. His tone was firm, professional, and without hesitation. He recommended Staff Sergeant Walsh for future Overwatch assignments and acknowledged her composure and technical excellence under pressure. Then, in a small gesture that silenced the room, he handed her a SEAL Team 7 challenge coin. "My team doesn't give these lightly," he said. "You earned it." The coin was heavy and warm in her palm, stamped with the emblem of men who once doubted her. She looked down at it for a moment before slipping it into her pocket. Her answer was simple. "Thank you." "Sir." The words carried no triumph, only quiet acceptance. For the first time, the respect in the room didn't have to be demanded. It was given freely. Outside, the desert wind rose again, carrying the soft rattle of flags against metal poles. For Emma, it wasn't the sound of victory. It was the sound of balance restored, of a weight finally lifting after years of silence. Months later, the air felt different. The dry sting of Helmand dust was replaced by the damp chill of rain against pavement. Back stateside, the barracks were quiet in a way the desert never was. The hum of fluorescent lights above her bunk was the only sound. Steady and constant, like a low heartbeat. Staff Sergeant Emma Walsh stood inside the narrow room, boots leaving faint prints on the concrete, the weight of her gear heavier now that it no longer had a purpose. The silence pressed in, strange and soft, the kind that only comes after years of noise. Her file sat open on the desk, a few clean pages noting what months of chaos had condensed into a single line. Commendation for professionalism, precision, and composure under pressure. The words were simple, neat, and entirely insufficient. They didn't speak of the hours spent breathing in dust, the moments between doubt and calm, or the quiet fight she had to wage every day to be seen as capable before even taking the shot. She had earned that respect twice, once against the enemy, once against disbelief. The paper couldn't capture either. She unzipped the rifle case slowly, the metallic click of the latches echoing through the empty room. The Macmillan TAC 50 rested, inside, clean, oiled, and still carrying the faint scent of the desert. She placed it on the rack, her movements deliberate. Then, from her pocket, she took out the SEAL Team 7 challenge coin and set it beside the rifle. The coin glinted under the harsh white light, its surface worn smooth by her fingers. It wasn't pride she felt, just a quiet sense of balance, the kind that came when something finally fit into place. Outside. The rain tapped lightly against the window. She looked once more at the rifle and the coin beside it. Records could fade, reports could be buried, but respect stayed. She hadn't aimed to break a record. She had aimed for respect, and she had hit the mark. Every story of courage starts quietly. Sometimes it begins in the noise of a battlefield, sometimes in the silence that follows. What matters isn't the record or the recognition, but the discipline it takes to stay steady when the world is shaking. If this story moved you, take a moment to tell us where you're watching from. And if you want to hear more stories of quiet strength and human resolve, stay with us. Because courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it speaks in the calm breath before the shot, and the silence that follows when respect finally finds its mark.